Welcome to the Autism Confidential, the podcast from the National Council on Severe Autism. I'm Jackie Kancir, Executive Director of NCSA, joined by my co-host, Amy Lutz, our Vice President, author, medical historian, and professor. Here on Autism Confidential, we shine a light on the toughest issues in the world of autism, including topics too often ignored or shunned by conventional media. Each episode, we take on the hardest conversations in autism with leading thinkers and doers. And our guest today is Freddie deBoer. He is a writer and academic whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He's the author of 3 nonfiction books and has just released his debut novel, The Mind Reels. We're looking forward to a candid conversation today about how media frames autism and mental illness, who gets to shape that narrative, and where our communities can find common ground. And of course, Freddie, we're going to give you a chance to talk about your new book as well.
Great.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Freddie, I have to say I don't participate in most of the podcasts, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk with you. I've been following your work since I read your incredibly impactful essay on the gentrification of disability. So I thought maybe we could start talking about how our paths have crossed, right? So for our audience, Freddie does not write from the world of autism. He writes as someone experienced with severe psychiatric illness. So maybe you could give us a little bit about your journey so far.
Yeah, so I hadn't intended to stick my finger in this particular electrical socket, but I am someone with a psychotic disorder, but I'm also a human being, and I have a large community around me, like we all do, including people with autism or ADHD or any number of what they call invisible disorders. I started having frustration coming from my own world, which is frustration with evolving disability culture and the way that it has a lot of presumptions about how you're supposed to feel about disability. I saw in my own space, I still do support groups. I'm quasi involved in sort of activism around bipolar disorder. I say quasi instead of deeply involved, precisely because my views on this are not welcome in a lot of these spaces. But I saw that this sort of evolving perspective that said that I have to love my disorder, that I have to view my disorder as a superpower, is a word that's thrown around a lot, that if I just regard my disorder as something that is just a negative in my life that I need to manage, and that I need to use medicine to manage, that was seen as internalized ableism, things like that. So there was this whole presumption, sort of set of presumptions that arose in the sort of early 2010s, maybe, that I deeply disagreed with, that were not treated as political ideas that were fair to be debated or disputed, that they were treated in a lot of these contexts as sort of the word of God. And I'm sort of, not amenable to that sort of thing in general. What specifically kind of got me into this conversation, the New York Times published what I thought was a incredibly irresponsible piece about people learning to live with the voices, in which they interviewed maybe 24 people with schizophrenia who have managed to be able to live without medication, which is great for them, right? I mean, I'm very happy for them individually. But as I and others said, the vast majority of people with schizophrenia can't live that way. Just about all of the people that were interviewed were highly educated and affluent people. There was not a single interview with a psychiatrist who had a different point of view, et cetera. And so I laid that out in a piece years ago, and I got invited to do a podcast. And it was a podcast by 3 mothers of adult sons with schizophrenia. And there's a wonderfully sweet woman who had me on their show. These are women who had, you could just, I only interacted with them online, and you could just feel the exhaustion coming off of them because they had spent their entire adult lives keeping their kids out of jail and out of institutions. And the first thing they said to me when I came on the podcast was, we felt so grateful that you wrote this down because we feel the same way, but we can't say it. Right. And the reason that they can't say it, supposedly, is that it violates, the nothing about us without us. It violates standpoint theory, these modern sort of identity politics sort of ideas that only people who have a disorder can comment on it. And I just felt so offended on their behalf that I just sort of said, fuck this. And I got sort of, I started writing about these things. And once you start writing about any of this stuff, you get pulled into the gravitational pull of autism, because this is the sharp edge of the stick, right? This is where all of this stuff comes down.
Yeah, I can say our community, you really blew up in our community when you wrote the piece on the gentrification of autism. And, here at NCSA, we've been really in the thick of this fight since our inception. It's really kind of part of our mission is to make sure that there's some sanity in that discourse. But our community was so grateful for your piece where you talked about the gentrification of autism.
Yeah. So one thing that I would sort of immediately interject for those who haven't heard of it in your audience. One of the things that initially inspired me to write that piece specifically was there was a conference at Harvard University on autism. And one of the panels, very naturally, was discussing cures and treatment, like what is of great interest to many families and many people with autism themselves. That panel, a group of Harvard students who identified as neurodiverse or whatever, protested that panel and were able to get it shut down. And just the thought of, look, it's not my place to diagnose anyone or to dispute their diagnosis. But you would think that if you have the capacity to get into Harvard, right, that if your disorder is so limited in its disabling effects, that you can get to Harvard, right, and flourish there, you would think outside of yourself and say, maybe this is not just about me. And I think that that's a big part of why this resonated so much. And for the record, in the years since, and you can, like, these people were public, they were in the Harvard Crimson, whatever. And I looked them up, and, these kids have gone on to work in Fortune 500 companies, and they are they're working as interns in congressional offices, and they're founding startups, which is, good for them. Right. But the families who cared about that panel are in the same place they were 3 years ago. Right. And that's what really offended me, I guess I would say.
So can you say what you meant by the gentrification? Because I think that's a really important issue across both of our communities.
Sure. So to get back to sort of my world, right? All of these disorders have a range of affliction, of severity, right? I will again stress that although I'm commonly accused of this, I don't police who has what. That's not my interest. I'm not here to tell any individual they don't have anything. But the people who were introducing, it's just a fact that the people who were introducing these ideas into these communal spaces for people with serious psychotic disorders were all the people who were the least afflicted, right? These were people who had gone off to college mostly and gotten radicalized with these ideas and were bringing them back to these spaces. So just to give you a brief sort of idea of what we're talking about here, there was a woman that I knew who herself has bipolar disorder. She's a PhD student who does a lot of work in these areas, and she had a class of students, and they were holding an event, and they had a couple disability rights activists come, which fine, whatever. And these were people who self-identified as people with schizophrenia. And they sort of integrated this with this local center that treats people with severe psychotic disorders, with people with really serious schizophrenia. And so there was an audience of maybe 50 people, and many of them were schizophrenics who had been in and out of the criminal justice system. Many of them had comorbid addiction problems, who had, leading fairly broken lives, and were trying to sort of crawl out of those lives. And these two people come and they delivered a lecture on not having internalized ableism, right? And I just remember sitting there and looking at the people and saying, here is someone who almost died because of a gangrenous wound that they didn't treat because their schizophrenia is so severe, right? That's the gentrification of disability. The gentrification of disability, the gentrification of autism is the way that systematically, over time, the people who are the least afflicted become the loudest voices in the room, right? Mm-hmm. If you are a schizophrenic living on the street, right? If you're someone who lacks even the most basic ability to care for yourself, you're not going online to go on Tumblr or Twitter and to spread your vision of what schizophrenia is. So the people who do that are necessarily coming from a particular slice of the sort of self-identified psychotic disorder population. With autism, this issue could not be more stark because, number one, you now have a definition of the disorder that is so capacious, as many people have said, anyone can fit into it if they want to. That has a massive online component, right? That there's these large online autism communities that target people that are very aggressive in targeting people sometimes, but also a very large, significant portion of the autistic community literally cannot speak. Right. And so what you have is gradually like the replacement of level 3 autism, profound autism, severe autism, whatever you want to call it, that has gradually been replaced in the eyes of the public with, as there was a piece in the New York Times today by Eileen May, I think is her name, right?
Emily May,
excuse me. Where she says when she says her kid is autistic, they think that she's a genius, right? And this is very widespread now. And so that exactly is the gentrification of autism, where the old sort of perception of autism, as flawed as it was, as stigmatizing as it may have been, right, as reductive as it may have been, centered people who need the most support. That has been completely erased now. And I think there were really negative consequences for all of that.
Well, there certainly are. And, Amy and I have personal experience with those consequences. You wrote, one of your books was on how the social elites had ate the social justice movement. Mm-hmm. And you talk about nonprofits and how they have some of this power in the narrative. And what made me actually reach out to Amy to see if we could do this podcast was when we were in the New York Times piece last week or the week before. You wrote a pretty blistering review of it on Substack. However, you really cut through the noise to talk about the fact that this has been being talked about for a very long time, and we're just now starting to center these voices. I had actually, just a couple of days prior to that, written a Substack that the ARC had posted that they were centering the voices of people with autism, and it was publications in the Washington Post, USA Today, about autism just being a difference and not the families like ours. So in a way, we had these really big, powerful nonprofits that are really controlling the messaging with the media. And I wonder if you've experienced that in your community and what you think we can do to really counter that.
So I think we should sort of get the elephant in the room out there, which is that what clearly motivated that piece from the New York Times was the engagement of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Trump, right? When RFK Jr. and Trump engaged in this issue, I simultaneously thought, wow, it's refreshing just to see people with severe autism, like their like existence acknowledged. But I also sort of hung my head and said, this is the worst thing that could happen, because in American media, everything has to be assigned a binary partisan valence. Everything has to be pushed from one thing to another. It was inevitable that after that happened, you saw this big sort of upswell of pieces saying, well, hey, look at all these flourishing autistic people. RFK doesn't know what he's talking about. Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. It became this politically polarized issue. And as you'll see in the New York Times piece from today, or many responses, so many people have to carefully say, I'm not a Trump supporter. However, it is nice to see the other side of the autism spectrum discussed at all right now, right? I don't have any particular problem with this individual, but it's worth saying that in their initial reaction to those pieces, both the New York Times and the John Oliver show, the John Oliver HBO show, they referred to a woman who is a poet who has been published in the New York Times, who jets around and does book signings or whatever. And they said this is the face of autism, right? Which again is just like, that is the definition of the gentrification of autism. Good for her. Good for her. I hope that she has all the success that she wants. When your defense of autistic people and your definition of autistic people in opposing the president of the United States is to say, hey, look at this one autistic person who has book contracts and went to Oxford or wherever she went, et cetera, et cetera. You are inevitably creating this construct that is going to silence people who shouldn't be silenced. And your point about the nonprofits is very, very important. There's all this talk about the rewriting of the DSM. I think 2011, was when the major things went down. So my next nonfiction book is being written right now, and it's all about disability in the 21st century. It'll be published next year. I'm doing a ton of research on it. It's really important to say that the changes to the DSM were heavily influenced by activist pressure. I mean, I think we should be really clear about this. It wasn't just that a bunch of scientists and researchers or clinicians got together and said, well, maybe we'll change this. There was intense pressure from some of the major autism nonprofits to get rid of the Asperger's diagnosis, to consolidate it all together, right? So they're making decisions that have real stakes. The DSM is heavily implicated in who gets what kind of support, right? Literally, when it comes down to who is going to be able to use certain kinds of funding and programs, the DSM plays a major role, and the nonprofits' hands were all over that. And I will just say this about nonprofits. So for that book that you mentioned, my second book there, about the elites in social justice, this didn't end up going into the book. My publisher wanted me to avoid these particular criticisms for legal reasons, whatever. But I was researching this book, and one of the main points is that these organizations, these nonprofits, their first job is always to perpetuate themselves, right? Their first job is always to and that's not like necessarily nefarious. It's true of it's true of your nonprofit in the sense that you've got to keep the lights on. You've got to get enough funding to be able to do this. But at a certain size, these things become, all they do is to perpetuate themselves. And so the funny thing is I found these two organizations, nonprofits, that were dedicated, their initial dedication and the reason that they existed was for the eradication of smallpox. You may have noticed that smallpox was eradicated in the 1970s. And my point being did these nonprofits close their doors? Did they say, okay, job well done? Did they stop taking donations? No, they just rebranded, right? The point being, you always have to understand these organizations as having a life of their own and becoming to have a sort of institutional logic that leaves behind anything to do with their initial purpose. And again, here's where the gentrification of autism really matters. Who is writing angry emails to Autism Speaks? Who is writing angry emails to fill in the nonprofit, of your choice? Who is sending the donation checks, right? Again, there's a structural reason why the most able, least disabled people with autism have the most influence in those organizations.
So I agree with you. Can we come back to the idea of the media and the New York Times? And I have to say, I am totally one of those writers who's been guilty of saying, I don't support Trump, but I'm glad to see profound autism kind of being addressed. I kind of think that without this conversation, maybe Emily May's piece never gets published in the New York Times. Before this all happened, the New York Times was publishing pieces the one that drove me to distraction was this. It almost sounded like a parody. It was a piece by a woman named Madeline who was like, "Dear parents of autistic children, your children are perfect. They're truth tellers. I'm autistic and I can tell you this." And it was just her waxing on about what angels our kids were. And I wrote a piece, it was like, "Dear New York Times Madeline, no, our autistic kids are not perfect." of course, that didn't get picked up by the Times. I had to publish that somewhere else. But I felt that the New York Times really was buying into a lot of this neurodiversity rhetoric. And now we're seeing a couple of articles recently that really do focus on more severe manifestations of autism. Is this progress?
Yeah, and
because isn't this the audience that needs to hear it? Because it really is the progressive left that is more likely to buy into this neurodiversity narrative in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. And please don't allow my bitterness over how the New York Times operates, et cetera, to mask the fact that I do think that it's progress. And I'm glad they're publishing these things. And I absolutely think we wouldn't have gotten here without the conversation that was provoked earlier, which provoked your piece in Persuasion and, et cetera, et cetera. Or was it the Free Press that you published that piece, or Persuasion?
No, mine was in Persuasion. Yeah, Jill.
Yeah. So it is progress. And you're right that these are the people that we have to reach. I mean, the simple reality is that this world is always going to be filled with progressive people, and that's good. They need to be reached. It's just there is still, I mean, it really is an issue that is live in a way that I can't imagine many other issues are right now, where it's not necessarily provoking immediate partisan backlash one or the other. And that makes people uncomfortable. I mean, I would stress that, like, one of the reasons why I like writing about this is because in my work, I'm always looking for those issues which is not just easily sort of moving from one camp to another, right? So I have a very diverse range of subscribers from far right to far left. That piece, the gentrification of disability, split my audience in half. I mean, it had people from all different walks of life with different opinions about it. It's also the piece, I've been doing this almost 20 years. I have never had a piece that's received more correspondence from more people or more different types of people than that piece. It's lived on for years after the fact. I've gotten more than 400 emails in sort of response to it since. I've heard from autistic people. I've heard from the families of autistic people, severely autistic people in particular. I've heard from teachers and aides who work in programs or schools for autistic children. I've heard it from researchers, clinicians, pediatricians. And I hear all kinds of things that are disturbing, right? Because when you put this into the world, people feel like they finally have a place to sort of share, So like one of the things that I've heard, at least a half dozen pediatricians have told me that, they deal with very aggressive parents who are looking for an autism diagnosis. And that is not in their clinical sort of decision making. And the parents really don't like it. I had someone who said that they brought a 4-month-old to them, insisting that the 4-month-old was autistic and wanted a diagnosis, right? Also, college professors telling me that half, 2/3, 3/4 of their students have specific sort of disability accommodations that allow them extra time on assignments, etc., either for ADHD or autism. I mean, like some of these, like Brown University or Princeton University, like 3/4 of the students that have these sort of things in some of these classes or programs. You can go online, you can Google around and just find on Reddit long threads from parents discussing how to get your kid one of these diagnoses, right? And they will just say straight up, well, I don't want to do this, but the other parents are all doing it, so I have to do it for my kid too. So I've become sort of a nexus for these things. It's an extremely passionate issue with a lot of really good points to go around. It's true that it's definitely progress that the New York Times is sort of sticking its neck out a little bit on this issue. It remains true, right? This is a kind of issue I can tell you from years of experience. People just don't want to get in the wrong way in this issue, right? It's like your average person who is a progressive liberal person who cares. They just see danger when they see the complexity of this kind of issue, and they'd prefer just to avoid it, right? And so it's sort of occupying that interesting space right now. I just think that I don't know where you go with a certain strain, which I know that you guys know all about, of academic disability studies people who consider themselves activists, who have gone very, very hard in the direction of autism as a different way of being, or even a better way of being, right? I hear from these people very often. I always say to people, like, look, just interpret all of this. Don't get into the sort of existential identity questions. Think about what's a problem and what do we need to solve, right? When the people tell me autism is a superpower, when they tell me autism is the next evolution of human development or whatever, which is all over the place. You can find that very easily. I say to them, okay, so you don't need accommodation then, right? Like if this is a superpower, if it's the next level of human evolution, then surely you don't need a disability accommodation. They say, what? You're taking my disability accommodation from me? So I then say, what do you need accommodation for? If it's a superpower, right? Like, that's not how it works. We don't see Superman and say that guy must need a lot of accommodation, right? And this is, again, like returns to the point. Sometimes I get from people is like, well, I see everything you're saying. You make some sense, but why don't you just leave it alone, right? Why does this matter? Why do you care if people are sort of making these sort of identities online, whatever, putting them in their Twitter, in their Tinder profile, whatever? And I say, look, the Americans with Disabilities Act has enemies and has always had enemies. It is an incredibly important law. It's as vulnerable as all the rest of them right now. The more that you casualize this, the more you confuse the boundaries, the more you undermine the basic moral logic of what we're talking about, the more threatened that is for everybody, right? The fundamental logic of disability accommodation says that in a fair and just society, when someone has a struggle, has a disability, has a difficulty doing something the rest of us can do, then you provide accommodations for them. And the more that they create the notion that all of this is just difference, right? The more you're underlining that basic logic. So it's a live issue right now. I just wish it wasn't Trump coded in the eyes of some people. I do think that I'll tell you that I never would have thought we would have gotten to this point 3 years ago. Because 3 years ago, when I started talking about this, all anybody wanted to talk about was honoring neurodiversity.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And with the both of you being in academics, something that I've often attributed this to as a similarity is what we did with indigenous assimilation and with inclusion, right? This push for inclusion, really that's what we were talking about, is how much can you assimilate into typical life? Can you live independently? Can you self-direct? And while it's important to make sure we provide those supports if somebody can, we've completely eliminated the possibility that somebody might not be able to live independently. And so for them, they're more segregated and isolated than ever because they can't assimilate into this typical society. And so as somebody who has come up all these decades, once in the disability justice movement, I just feel like they've lost their way. Like, this has had now an adverse effect from what it was originally intended, that we're not actually centering those that have the heaviest burdens anymore.
Yeah, and I agree that... Go ahead, Betty.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that I completely agree with this, that a lot of this is coming out of the academy. I'm heading next week to a big conference, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, to give a talk about the telepathy tapes and the intact mind and kind of this deranged autism discourse and facilitated communication. And I was thinking about whether I should go or not. It's a lot of work to get this done, but the reason why I ended up deciding to do it is because I think this is the audience that needs to hear it. In the academy, so much of disability comes out of this, just like disability studies as a discipline comes out of this social model of disability. And, disability studies is like the only, I think, kind of discipline in the academy that is just based on this ideological assumption. It takes that ideological assumption of the social model of disability, that there's nothing wrong with anybody individually. The problem is a lack of accommodations in the environment, and build the whole field around it. So all the discourse within the university is, even if you don't have a disability studies department, like Penn does not, where I work, but it's still all kind of comes from that impulse.
Yeah, I mean, I should make the disclaimer I often make, which is that I think people misunderstand where I'm coming from. I grew up in and still consider myself part of an academic lefty background, right? Like I grew up on Wesleyan University, which is about as freaky deaky and leftist as it gets. And I still maintain, to me, the best version of those ideals. I spent many, many hundreds of hours of my life as an activist, way back in the anti-Iraq war days, in housing activism, in grad student organizing, etc. I have to tell you, I've tangled with a lot of activists from a lot of backgrounds. The disability people are the nastiest. I'm not saying that that's like a scientific finding. I'm just saying in my experience. It comes down to this, right? Number one, you don't find a lot of this stuff in blind communities, right? Like, in other words, there's plenty of verbiage in the autistic community or certain parts of the autistic community, in the ADHD community, and some other communities where they talk about it being like a better way to live, right? There's very few blind people who say, oh, yeah, no, I prefer to be blind, right? Because the impairment is so severe, right? It makes life very, very difficult. There are plenty of proud blind people, right? But there's very few people who say, no, I prefer to be blind, right? Or that this is just as good, or this is just a different way of being. We don't pretend that, an infant born with Tay-Sachs who has a life expectancy of like maybe 3 years at the most, right? Or Huntington's disease, right? We don't pretend that those are things that are just different ways of knowing or being, right? So that's right off the bat. The universality of what they're saying is not correct. But also, if you just look at sort of autistic people, right? If you have an autistic person who is an adult, who has never articulated spoken language in their life, who cannot clothe themselves, who cannot maintain their own bathroom functions, who cannot feed themselves, who cannot stop repetitively injuring themselves, right? Who, if you left them alone for 24 hours, would likely die or be in terrible shape, right? You can sort of set about to articulate how that's just like, something that should be accommodated by a society and it's not inherently bad. But doing so is such an obvious farce, right? That the people who care for those people would never engage in it. And just at some point, you just have to step outside of yourself and say, I'm sorry people have made you feel bad about who you are. I really am. And I wouldn't participate in that myself. But you are not the cosmos, right? Like, I mean, at some fundamental part, if you're that Harvard activist who's going to leave school in a couple of years and go live a hard-charging life of a high income and being, in a big deal at cocktail parties, you have to have it within you to sort of set your own stuff aside. There's one of the women that I've talked to via email since I published this piece. So she is got one of the autistic kids. So he is not, in fact, entirely nonverbal. But what he is relentlessly self-injurious, right? Relentlessly hits himself in the head, has a ton of scar tissue, has developed abscesses, stuff like that. So her particular issue is, there are some activists who believe that any kind of physical restraint for an autistic person is a medieval torture device, that it's inherently a hideously cruel thing. And they say this is like stuff out of the Spanish Inquisition or whatever. As she has said to me, the alternative to her putting him in a restraint is that she sits next to him and she herself physically restrains him every waking minute of his life because he cannot stop hitting himself, right? And I just would hope that at some point, right, you would recognize that whatever you're reading about in whatever academic journal you're subscribed to, there is a certain fundamental truth in that woman's experience, right, that has to be a bigger deal than your feelings of stigma or whatever that is. I say this all the time. I have a severe psychotic disorder. I've been treated and medicated for a long time. I'm very lucky in that way. Many people don't make it here. But I've been in really bad shape before. Never in my life has stigma been one of my top 100 problems, right? Like when I was chronically getting arrested, that was a real problem. When I was threatening to kill an ex-girlfriend, that was a real problem, right? When I thought someone put glass in my cereal, that was a real problem. Stigma was not a real problem for me, right? And the whole thing has to be oriented. But once again, the kid who keeps hitting himself is not going to be publishing articles in Harvard journals, right? he literally cannot go to a conference and give you a testimonial, right? And the woman who cares for him has been systematically read out of these things because it is, if you look in many of these sort of disability studies places, it's a matter of holy writ that family members are not us, so they don't get to talk about autism, which is just eliminating such a huge range of the experience.
Yeah, I just wrote about this the other day. And I think what is helping our community and what is something we can look forward to is most recently the research has really started to delineate this and show a variety of many forms of autism and a difference between early diagnosed autism versus late diagnosed, the difference between broadly affected and social behavioral and profound autism. I mean, there's so many new subtypes, and I believe that's really what it's going to come down to. It's a lot of different forms of autism, which will allow us to better provide precision treatment for this. I have said for a long time that if this is your identity, if this is something that you identify with, why aren't we having that conversation on the same academic stages as we do on things like sex and gender and other identities? That seems like that would make such a better stage for those conversations. But this part of the autism spectrum is in such need of complex medical and behavioral support, it's impossible to separate medical from it. And so when parents are talking about autism or advocating for autism, we're not talking about the autism of the person with the PhD candidate. We're talking about those individuals who can't get up on a stage and tell you how very different their life is.
Yeah. If I could share like what the thing that bothers me the most about all of this, and there's a lot of things that bother me about it. There has recently, so one of the ways that the sort of hive of this sort of neurodiversity pride, it's not disability, it's just difference, et cetera, this whole movement. One of the things that they've done, again, like recently, more and more advocates and families and parents have been able to sort of force into the conversation, say, hey, this is my kid. I will spend the rest of my life taking care of my kid. I'm terrified of dying because then he's going to go into some awful home. This is my reality. Please don't tell me this is just difference, right? As more people have been able to sort of inject that into the conversation, there has been the rise of this claim, which is, if you have a person like that, if you have a level 3 autistic, severe autistic, whatever you want to call them, that's actually not the autism disabling them. Rather, that person might have autism. But what it is like that's an intellectual disability, or that's schizophrenia or something, which, number one, reasserting that autism and schizophrenia are overlapping after we left that behind 50 years ago is pretty bad, number one. But number two, the idea that autism itself does not disable, right? The idea that it's okay, they have autism, but what's disabling them is some co-occurring psychosis or intellectual disability, whatever. That is such a massive scientific finding, right? Like that is a huge scientific finding. And you say, well, who found it? Was it researchers? Was it clinicians, doctors? There was some blue ribbon panel that figured that out. And it's just a bunch of people online decided that was true because it was argumentatively convenient for them, right? One of the really kind of, I don't know, sad things about this sort of debate right now is, as the notion of breaking up the spectrum has become more and more, has gotten more and more play, as it's gotten more and more attention, there's this kind of sub debate in these things about who gets to keep autism, meaning that if we split the spectrum, right, do the high functioning, like neurodiversity activist people get to keep the term autism, or do the low functioning level 3, people, et cetera, people get to keep the term autism? And to my perspective, it's just, if you're worrying about that, you're not disabled. Okay. Like if your investment in this is the question of the word, Because I can promise you that the families dealing with the kids who need the most support, that is very, very low down on their priority list, right? And to me, like, that is a symbol of how through the looking glass we are in here now, where a disability that causes massive damage to individuals and to families, and often requires immense support, lifelong support, that people are like squabbling over who gets to keep the name under a theoretical splitting up of the spectrum in the future. It just sort of shows how weird everything has gotten.
Yeah, I think that I can speak for everyone at NCSA. Say they can have the term autism. Allison Singer, who is also on our board, has famously said, you can call it, my daughter has Ishkabibble disorder. I don't care at all. But we just need to split up the spectrum. So it's, and as we think about that, it's interesting to think about the allies we need to be kind of connecting with. And yesterday, Jackie and I were talking, and we both expressed, kind of just interest and commitment in connecting with families and individuals dealing with severe psychiatric disorders as more natural allies than perhaps higher functioning people with autism and their families, because our concerns, as we've talked about in this whole hour, are so aligned, and the issues we're dealing with around representation, around the need for acute care, acute specialized, maybe inpatient care, or certainly those types of services, people who can't make decisions on their own, the issue of privilege, and academic people, we called it partial representation, where the least affected are the ones who are speaking for the community. Like these, there's so much overlap, and yet our advocacy is so siloed. We hardly ever connect with the groups that I don't even know who they are, if it's NAMI or somebody else who represents the people who are the families of people with really severe intractable psychiatric disorders. How can is this like a larger community we should be really dedicated to building?
Well, now you're the one sticking your finger in an electrical socket here. So first, let me say of NAMI specifically, I think NAMI is an excellent organization in many ways. My wife is a long-term volunteer with NAMI who leads support groups and things like that. She's a big believer. I myself have done many support groups or many sessions of support groups through NAMI, and I'm very grateful for the resources. But NAMI is the picture of the fact that these nonprofits have a donor class that are very influential, and that donor class tends to be a very specific kind of person, which is a educated, but not really about mental illness, affluent, liberal, urban person who tends to be the kind of person who has very romantic ideas about mental illness. And so one of the things you can see within NAMI, as you can see, a sort of internal war, because you have a lot of people there who really do direct interaction and outreach with severely psychotic people, and who know better than to romanticize that condition. And then you have this whole sort of fundraising apparatus. And so there's sort of perpetually a sort of group of NAMI watchers like me that I'm sort of connected with, where it's like they'll put out some dopey email where it's just like, oh, come celebrate difference. And, schizophrenia is just, it's just another way of being, whatever. And we sigh, but then we say, well, they do so many good things, right? And that's sort of the difficulty. So you sort of have that institutional side, and then there's the anti-psychiatry movement, right? Which is another big part of this big book that I have coming out, and which sort of intersects with the sort of autism stuff in interesting ways. The anti-psychiatry movement is convinced that mental illness does not exist. It is sort of dependent on the idea that all of these things are just difference, not disability, in a very weird way, right? It has the same sort of internal cruelty as this sort of neurodiversity movement stuff, which is because they insist that mental illness does not exist. The anti-psychiatry people often wind up in a place where there's no accommodation made for mental illness, right? So, for example, legal accommodation, right? If I go manic and I go out and I commit a crime, I'll be in a lot of trouble, but there will be some sort of special legal dispensation for me because I was psychotic, right? The anti-psychiatry people are opposed to all of that, because they say mental illness doesn't exist, right? And so there's this weird thing where they're constantly sort of valorizing and sanctifying people with severe mental illness because we're the ones who sort of are living real lives or, whatever. But they're also always cutting us off at the knees because they need to insist that anything bad we do is not the fault of mental illness because mental illness doesn't exist. Right. And there's a sort of a continuity with that and the sort of autism thing where they think of themselves as the biggest autism advocates. But if you actually sort of created a culture based around their vision of autism, there would be nothing to provide accommodation for. Right. I do think that there's room for outreach. And I think that that's a very good idea to sort of make those connections. I wish there was a good organization, but there's not. I can definitely provide a list of places that I think would be more sort of constructive than not. But you have all the weird institutional things going on in mental illness, which includes a very loud and aggressive anti-psychiatry movement. You have the anti-pharma people. You have, and then again, like the institutional players or players like NAMI, which inevitably end up getting bent by sort of needing to sort of hew to a very particular kind of line. But I will say, like, look, a lot of people don't like to talk about schizophrenia because they think that it's incurable. And it is incurable in terms of getting rid of it right now. But it is not the case that there is no hope for better medications. So I think that this has been very underreported. We're living through a revolution in antipsychotic medication right now. There is a host of new antipsychotics that have been developed recently that have dramatically less punishing side effects that are much more pleasant to take. And I mean, that is such a huge part of the problem in this world because as someone who's spent many years on them, antipsychotics are truly punishing to be on, at least conventional ones. And we have these new drugs, right? And the point is that like that should be celebrated. But because of the sort of fractured nature of the communities that I'm in, like the anti-psychiatry people get mad about these new antipsychotics. And you'd say, but these don't cause tremors. They don't have the terrible weight gain. You don't have the sudden death that can happen with some of these antipsychotics, et cetera. What's not to like? Well, they don't like it because you're taking away one of their talking points, right? In other words, they don't want to hear about better medication because bad medication has always been a big thing for them. So it's just a very fractured world with, unfortunately, like not like a very clear sort of direction of where things are going. But I do think that it's a good example of where just because something has a heavy genetic component, and schizophrenia does, or psychotic disorders do, just because something is old and has been studied forever, just because something is a longstanding problem, doesn't mean that you can't come up with new medications that, if nothing else, make managing the condition much more pleasant.
Yeah, and you've tackled some really taboo topics yourself. And Amy and I both have children who have had catatonia and have been on ECT treatments for a very long time, very successfully, no side effects. It's saved their lives. We've written extensively about it, and you yourself also have talked about ECT, but we still have states that have these very, just very biased and archaic views of ECT as if this is, one flew over the cuckoo's nest. Right. And so they're limiting access to these individuals, and catatonia, malignant catatonia, can be fatal. So they're actually limiting a life-saving treatment due to this stigma and bias that exists even in policy surrounding medical treatments.
Yeah, I mean, look, like there's catatonia, but it's also like, which is a big deal. I mean, there's a number of conditions that are addressed by ECT. When it comes to severe treatment-resistant depression, which is both one of the most brutal things anyone can experience and has an extremely high suicide rate that is associated with it. There is quite literally nothing that has an effect size like ECT. There is, if you choose to go looking, and you have to go looking, unfortunately, for the reasons that you just described, there are a number of testimonials you can find out there of people who were convinced they were going to kill themselves and who had their lives saved by ECT. It is just a perpetual frustration in discussing psychiatry that the sins of the past are always used to dismiss the techniques of the present, which there's no branch of medicine, right, that doesn't have a past filled with bad ideas, right? The fact that people used to treat things with leeches, right, or they used to do bleeding procedures on people with fevers doesn't invalidate those branches of medicine. ECT is, it's true, not 100% performed with a raft of sort of patient consent forms, and that's unfortunate, but it's very close to being at this point because the procedure is so controversial. It's very close to the point now where close to 100% of people who receive ECT in the United States have not just one, but a whole raft of consent forms, and they have to go through a whole informed consent process. Them, or in the cases of things like catatonia, where the person literally is not able to do this, where the person who is their legal guardian does it. ECT is now exclusively performed under general anesthesia. So the grim, visions of people being awake and having their brain, shot up, whatever, it's just not happening anymore. They're going under general anesthesia and receiving this treatment. It's an extreme thing, right? To literally shock someone's brain. It is an extreme thing, and no one is doing it casually. But it's just nothing like the way people describe it. But it's so hard to fight against the sort of public perception of these things. So again, like, it gets back to this mother who I was talking about, whose son needs to be in restraints at least part of the day, right, so that she can like do basic stuff, right? Whenever you're speaking about things generally, she says, the idea of restraining an autistic child drives people into absolute rage. When she sits down and says, "Hey, let me show you what he looks like if I mistakenly leave him for like 5 minutes, right? Let me show you what he can do to himself and how exhausted I am, right?" And then people say, "Oh, well, in that case, right?" And and this is like the thing with ECT, with antipsychotics, with many things having to do with people with severe autism. You have to constantly interject sort of like lived experience and like specific reality, because their big picture sort of uninformed assumptions are always going to be, this is cruelty, this is barbarism, this is whatever.
Well, I've gone rounds with my state. It took a long time. They've finally, I'm pretty sure that we're in agreement at this point. But in the beginning, and I mean, this took me maybe 5-6 years of advocating to get them to understand that the law is least restrictive, and that total unrestricted actually can be a violation of least restrictive, that complete unrestricted can cause somebody to have to be in a more restrictive environment than if they had a lesser restrictive option. And so that was a long legal argument, but I think it's one that we're finally coming to an understanding on.
Yeah, I mean, this is a constant that I return to all the time in the debates about psychotic disorders, which is I am an advocate for more aggressive involuntary commitment, which really sort of viscerally turns a lot of people off. My own life was saved by involuntary commitment. If in 2002, when I first went inside, as we say, if I hadn't gotten committed, I'm sure I would have killed myself. I would always take a look at like the example of James Holmes, who was the Aurora, Colorado shooter, right? Who killed 12 people in a movie theater. Absolutely classic schizophrenic. Everything about his case, the timing of it, the age in which it developed, the way it represented itself, his paranoia, his delusions, etc. It is absolutely classic case of the onset of paranoid schizophrenia. And that's the kind of person that I say, we should, could have been caught, earlier in a situation where it's easier to involuntarily commit people, because he specifically was evaluated by a psychiatric staff member at University of Colorado. And the person said, this guy's not well, but he doesn't meet the conditions for involuntary commitment. Now, people always think that I'm talking about saving the lives of those 12 people who were murdered by him. And that's true, right? And I do think that we could have saved their lives, and that matters. But if you're someone who cares about like not putting people in severely restrictive environments, well, look, James Holmes is going to spend the rest of his life in a max security prison. right? He doesn't belong there. He's nearly been killed by other inmates on several occasions. He belongs in a psychiatric hospital. If you care about these things, if you care about keeping people out of super restrictive sort of conditions, well, then you should really care about keeping them out of jail. And what happens over and over again with people who have psychotic breaks and don't get involuntarily committed, they end up in the prison system, which is so much worse for them anyway, right? So it's not a question of like, is there a perfect, better alternative? It's that if we caught more people early on, we could save their lives and save them from the most kind of restrictive and unpleasant experience possible.
So I know we've been nearing the end of our hour. We just wanted to give you a chance to tell everyone about your new book, because we'd love to hear about it.
I did read it.
Oh, good. Yeah. So it's my first published fiction. So I have been approached on several occasions about writing a mental illness memoir, but sort of it didn't make a lot of sense. For one, I don't have a lot of great stories. And the reason I don't have a lot of great stories to tell is because, as my basic ethos about mental illness goes, mental illness is generally quite boring, right? Like it's not dramatic. Part of the problem, part of what makes this all so difficult to sort through is that we are in society, we are subject to so many depictions of mental illness in movies or TV shows or novels or whatever that are super dramatic, that have narrative arcs where there's all kinds of interesting things that happen, right? And that's just not what it's like, right? I always use the example of Girl Interrupted, which is this wonderful memoir by Susanna Kaysen about her time spent in a psychiatric hospital. And I enjoy the movie, but if you watch the movie, it's very different. And it's very different because they had to make a ton of stuff up. Why did they have to make a ton of stuff up? Because being in a psychiatric hospital is not very, very interesting, right? And so I didn't want to write a memoir and sort of like, number one, have to make up anything to have any story to tell. But number two, to sort of, I felt like writing a memoir would sort of contribute to the idea that my story is interesting, and it's not, right? Like most of my story is, sweating in shitty apartments, getting skinnier and skinnier, drinking alcohol by the gallon, growing more and more paranoid until I finally break, and then ending up back in treatment and in an institution somewhere and getting fatter from antipsychotic meds. It's not the story that you want to hear. So I thought I'll tell it in fiction. And so what I've hoped that I've done is to sort of discuss the experience and demonstrate the experience of having bipolar disorder in fiction rather than in nonfiction. It's the story of a young woman named Alice who goes to college and who develops bipolar disorder at her freshman year. And it is, I hope, true to life in that she loses friends, she loses opportunity, her life gradually descends into chaos and unhappiness. She is immensely vulnerable to sexual predation and to the other people around her. And her life is a long, often unbearable slog of trying to dig out, because that's what it's actually like. And that's what I hoped to depict, and also made it a book worth reading. But that's up to everybody else to decide.
Yeah. And what was the experience like writing a fictionalized account based on all your extensive experience with writing nonfiction?
Yeah, it was cathartic, and it was fun. And it was nice to have some of the constraints taken off and to sort of like explore things that in ways that are more poignant than I could make them in a sort of nonfiction, sort of thing. Like I said, if it was actually traumatic, maybe my life would have been more enjoyable. But this comes back again to this sort of activist pressure to say that this is all sort of a beautiful journey, and it's great. Like if you're one of those schizophrenics that the New York Times writes about, who can channel their disorder into art classes in Sedona, then good for you, right? But like for me, it was a long, life ruining process, and you can't get to good policy and humane medicine based on a lie about what these things are like. And so I'm just trying to correct the record in whatever way I can.
Well, we appreciate you, and we certainly appreciate you coming on to talk with us about this.
Thank you so much, Freddie, for talking with us. I know that your work has really resonated with our community.
Have you guys heard of the podcast Christianity on the Spectrum?
I think I was on that podcast.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So I had a really good appearance on there, and he is a guy, like, we had a part of our discussion that I was happy to have is like, we were talking about, I sometimes get accused of thinking that like ASD 1 doesn't exist or something, or ASD 2. And I was saying like we had a discussion about, what people call ASD 0, which is like, those are the people who I think really do just adopt it as like a whatever. But he's a computer programmer, and he's someone who's functional in many ways, but whose life has been really, made more difficult by ASD 1. And we had a whole good conversation about like, this thing is real, but that's not the problem. Like the problem is that like, is the creation of this identity layer that has no connection to anything. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's the difference in the types of support. I just recently did a video where I talked about my brain tumor journey, and my cousin also had a brain tumor. We both had brain tumors, but his was a different type of tumor, and he didn't survive. I did, and so my journey, my options, my treatment options were different. And his were different, and thank goodness he had hospice as an option. That would have been very offensive to me. So I understand where they're coming from when they hear parents talking about certain treatments or options and the search for research, but we're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about two forms that are very different from one another.
A few things that you cannot combine and have any cope at a good conversation. You cannot combine self-diagnosis is just as valid as any other. And also a spectrum that is so wide, it encompasses everything possible, but also only people with this thing get to talk about it, right? Because then what you're doing is you're saying anyone can self-identify into this thing and speak dispositively, but anyone who does not self-identify into it cannot say anything. It doesn't work.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Autism Confidential by National Council on Severe Autism. Don't forget to like and subscribe.